After starting out in student politics, Grant Robertson rose through the Labour ranks to become Finance Minister and Deputy Prime Minister. His government met COVID-19 with an almighty fiscal response, which critics say was excessive, but he maintains ultimately saved lives and livelihoods. Grant Robertson has just penned a memoir reflecting on his life and years in politics. His new role as Vice-Chancellor of Otago University. In 18 months since he resigned from politics, we sat down in Dunedin in the university's historic council chambers. With a bit of space, a little bit of perspective, what do you miss most about day-to-day politics?
Oh, it's hard to find something, to be honest with you. I miss the people. I miss my colleagues. There's some fantastic friends of mine in the Labour caucus, but also across Parliament. And so, yeah, there's a dynamism, isn't there, to politics that's exciting. But I can't say I miss all of the things I had to do.
I've noticed there are not currently any students occupying the VC's office at Otago University, which marks a difference from the time you were studying here. How different is life for the students here today compared to when you studied?
There's a lot of things that are the same. I look at the students and I see them, making their new friends and finding out about themselves and learning really exciting new subjects or having big breakthroughs in the way they view the world. Perhaps on the other side is I see an increased level of pressure on students. They sit 2 lots of exams a year. There's a lot of pressure on what is their future employment going to look like. And I do wish for them that they had time to step back and really enjoy the experience. But it's a formative time in life, and it's fantastic being around students who are having those experiences.
Speaking of formative times in life, I'm going to get to your experience in government in a couple of minutes, but I want to start with some formative stuff. Some viewers may not be aware, your dad was convicted of stealing about $120,000 and sentenced to 2 years in prison. This happened when you were in your late teens, early 20s. What does that do to a person? What is it like going to prison and seeing your dad behind bars for the first time?
Enormously confronting. And the first time I did, the thing I immediately can recall is how cold it was. And I remember going into the prison with my mother, and there was the classic jailer with a big set of keys, and one door would be unlocked and then another, and it got darker and colder. And Dunedin prison at the time was literally a Victorian prison. It was built in 1901, I think. And it was enormously confronting. And, there was my dad who I loved and, loved very much, but who had done this stupid thing and had let everybody around him down. And it was a massive experience for me. And, he was in there for about 18 months in the end. And I kept visiting him, but it never got easier.
The sense I got was that you were very angry with him, and yet you felt compelled to visit him week after week after week. You would drive past the prison on your way to work at a supermarket and you'd wave at him out of the window. So talk to me a little bit about that tension.
Yeah, I think anyone who's perhaps had a relative in prison might understand that. I never stopped loving Dad. He was a good dad to me and my brothers, but he'd done this really stupid thing, and at various points while he was in prison, I was sort of, do you really understand what you've done? I mean, he breached the trust of the people around him in his workplace, and that's a horrendous thing to do. He also breached the trust of his family. We didn't know that this had been going on. So yeah, it was a struggle and a tension. And then even after Dad got out of prison, it was still that, how do you rebuild your life, and some of the kind of things that drove his behaviour I still witnessed, and that was hard too. So yeah, it had a big impact on me. It had a big financial impact on me. I went from having a father who was pretty much supporting my studies financially to having nothing. And it was a really tough time. The person who I most admire in that period was my mother, because obviously she had no idea this was happening and then had to rebuild her own life. Dunedin's an amazing city, but it's quite small, so everybody kind of knows your business. And her courage and fortitude in getting through that time, I still find astounding.
Yeah, you describe her as a remarkable woman throughout your book. Did you forgive your dad?
Yes, I did. I think I had to in the end, but I was still, like you said, I had that mixture of emotions of love for him, but also deep frustration at what he'd done to others and what he'd done to himself.
Relationships are complex.
They certainly are. Family's a concept.
The thing that first drew you to politics was when you were studying here. university fees. And once you made it into Parliament and you were working within government, although not yet an MP, you were part of the team that introduced interest-free student loans. And you now have this unique perspective of returning to your alma mater as VC. How do you reflect on the legacy of the interest-free policy?
I think it was incredibly important because what was happening there was that the level of debt that people were getting into was just spiralling. I think it was 8% interest on the loan when I was studying here. When I was studying here, you actually had the interest compounding from the moment you borrowed. Helen Clark's government came in and changed that so that interest only came when you graduated, and then eventually we went to interest-free loans. So I think what it's done is taken away some of the stress that exhibited for students around debt. I think it's reduced the overall amount of debt that students have, and it's just settled that area. It doesn't mean that it's easy somehow for students today. Costs are still high, and it's difficult, but the overall funding of tertiary education means that student fees are part of the picture, but at least now there's a loan scheme that you can borrow those interest-free.
So a little bit easier for students, but of course there is a fiscal impact at the government end of the equation. In some students' cases, depending on what they're studying, they might have benefited by thousands, if not tens of thousands of dollars through that interest-free policy. In reflecting on that policy, do you think it contributed to a culture where heading into elections, New Zealanders would say, what's in it for me, rather than what's in it for New Zealand?
I don't think so. I think the interest-free loan policy was about making sure that tertiary education was seen as both a public good, which it absolutely is, but also something that has private benefit. And I think actually it's an example of almost the opposite of what you're saying, that tertiary education matters sufficiently for the whole of society that we're going to create a system that at least makes it somewhat affordable for people to be part of. I do, obviously I'm a person who believes in looking at the collective view and how as a country we benefit, but I actually think investing in our students and our future does do that.
Let's talk your time in Parliament. So on several occasions in the book, you discuss the scale of your spending as Finance Minister, and you say that many of your critics are purveyors of, quote, hindsight economics. They were, at times, calling for more spending and more stimulus, but in the spirit of introspection, do you now accept that your government spent too much?
No. There were no costless decisions in COVID. We either paid in money or we paid in lives. And we did say we'd go hard and early, that we would push for cash flow and confidence when it came to the economic side of things. And I don't regret doing that. Of course there were things within the spending that we did that didn't quite work out the way we wanted. But if you look at the bulk of the $60 billion odd that we did spend, it was in areas like keeping businesses going, making sure people had money to put food on the table, making sure that we understood the health response and funded that properly. So I get it. I get the fact that in hindsight you say, gosh, that's a lot of money. It was a lot of money, but it was a necessary response to keep New Zealanders healthy and to keep New Zealanders in work.
Treasury's long-term insights briefing last week put the cost of the pandemic in New Zealand at $66 billion. It said New Zealand had the largest fiscal response per capita of any country in the world except for the United States, and that your spending in the second half of the pandemic response was pro-cyclical. It implied that you spent excessively against explicit advice. Did the scale of the spending match the outcomes?
Yeah, I'd even challenge the assumption there. If we think about the period in the latter part of 2021, absolutely Treasury was saying, you've got to be careful about the amount you're spending. But they also recommended in papers I remember from August and September of 2021, when Delta arrived, that we should keep support going. They said don't increase it too much, but keep it going. By May 2022, when the budget was put forward, we closed the COVID fund. So in a sense, I don't really disagree with them at one level. I just think there's a little bit of hindsight there too. Yes, we had to be careful, but they also said you need to look after businesses and families when Delta arrived as well.
But there was that direct support, and then there were lots of examples through the COVID fund of what could probably generously be described as less direct support. So to that question though, do you think, you say that the spending was necessary, but my question is, do you think the scale of the spending was matched by the outcomes?
Generally, yes. As I said, there are going to be things where it didn't work.
Well,
one example of that would be the so-called shovel-ready fund, where we obviously said construction industry, infrastructure, not only do they need help with COVID, there's also a long-term deficit around infrastructure that's built up. We went out to the community and said, what projects have you got that are ready to go? People came back and said, these are ready to go. Turned out quite a few of them actually weren't quite ready to go. And so the spending there ended up happening both over a longer time and perhaps not in quite the way we might have wanted. But I come back to the point, the overall view that we had to spend, invest to get health and economic outcomes, and then there was going to be a point where that had to pull back, I don't actually disagree with. I just think in that latter part of 2021, when Delta arrived, we actually had to be spending then.
So there's the shovel-ready projects. Are there any other spending decisions that come to mind that you think didn't work out as you'd intended?
Not particularly. I mean, there are some of the investments in job creation, Jobs for Nature and so on, where I still think it was a good fund, but again, we perhaps didn't get all of the outcomes we were looking for there.
Do you think that tinkering with the Reserve Bank Act, it's happened a few times over the last few years, did the reforms that have happened with the Reserve Bank Act have any meaningful impact on decisions when it's come to the OCR?
Oh, you have to ask the Reserve Bank Governor that question. I think having employment as one of the things that we have the bank focused on is a good thing, because there have been times in New Zealand's history where perhaps that focus was lost and we didn't get the balance right between controlling inflation and making sure the rest of the economy keeps operating well. I think the decision to have more than just the Reserve Bank Governor as a decision maker, which was one of the reforms we made, has made for more robust decisions. And you've even seen examples now of individuals who dissent, that being recorded. I think that's good for transparency. I still believe in the changes that we made. I've heard Reserve Bank folks say we're still thinking about employment even if it's not one of our core objectives.
Well, this is why I wonder if it actually, the reforms of the last few years, when it comes to the dual mandate at the very least, have actually had a meaningful impact on OCR decisions.
Yeah, and as I say, you've got to think about monetary policy over a really long run, and it might not be in a 5-year or 8-year cycle that it is relevant, but it might be in a 10 or a 20-year cycle.
Right. Have you spoken to Adrian Orr since he left?
No.
You describe your various flirtations with tax changes, a CGT and a wealth tax.
Flirtations and tax just together. It's incongruous.
Hey, this is Q&A, come on. Ultimately, Labor never ran with those during your time in government. But from your knowledge of tax and your experience in political strategy, what would a party have to get right for enough of the public to support a CGT in an election?
I think it's about understanding what it actually is, i.e. that it's a tax on the gain that you get. It's not a tax on owning a home. To be really clear about what's in and what's out and have decent runway to be able to explain what's in and what's out. And also to be clear, as ever with taxation, about what's going to happen with the money. What's going to be able to be done that isn't able to be done now. Now, I'm not saying it has to be a CGT or it has to be a wealth tax. What I say, and I say it in the book a few times, I think, is New Zealand's tax system is unbalanced and unfair. I said that a number of times when I was a politician too. And I'd love it if this somehow or other could be a cross-party thing. If you look around the world, capital gains taxes, asset taxes have been shared in their being introduced by governments of left and governments of right. Because we all understand that there's an asset class not being properly taxed here. I wish we could get to a point in New Zealand society where we just said, actually, we do need to broaden that tax base. It's unfair on wage and salary earners that we're not taxing assets.
From a strategic perspective, though, are there things that you could do that you would do if you were the government of the day and you wanted a capital gains tax to endure through political cycles? For example, peg future revenue from a capital gains tax to spending and borrowing today.
You could do that, absolutely, and that would be one way to try and get a greater buy-in. I just think it's so mainstream around the world, it's almost ridiculous to be having a conversation about the fact that we can't do it because we haven't done it. It is so commonplace. I think it should be able to go across parties.
You chose not to publicly appear before phase 2 of the COVID inquiry. Given you and your colleagues gladly embraced the spotlight when it suited during the COVID response, doesn't the public deserve the transparency and accountability that comes with a public appearance?
Well, I'm not sure I'd even buy into the way you describe what it was like during that period. That's part of the point. For 5 years, we answered and have answered questions about COVID, about the impacts of COVID. It's not like there hasn't been numerous opportunities over a long period to hear from us in the public arena. I have participated in both phases of the COVID inquiry. I think in total now I'm up to about 4.5 hours worth of interviews. When I finished my most recent interview with this phase, one of the staff of the Royal Commission said to me, "You've given me all of the questions, you've answered all of the questions we've asked and more." So we have participated. I have participated. I don't know that in a lessons learned inquiry, the kind of show trial approach is actually that valuable.
Why do you think it's a show trial?
Because this is about lessons learned. It's not about, I think the phrase that was used in one of the pieces of correspondence was, this would be more performative than informative. And we've got a number of issues to think about here. We've got precedent. We haven't done this in Royal Commissions in New Zealand in the past, have politicians and former politicians come into public arena. When we were in government around the mosque shootings and around the earthquakes in Christchurch, conversations happened with ministers and former ministers, but not in that kind of public hearing.
COVID is, I think, by all means, the defining experience of your time in government. And during the parliamentary protests, you said you were scared to leave your house. People screamed at you in public. They called you truly appalling things, words that I can't repeat here. But years on, your government and Jacinda Ardern in particular are still, for whatever reason, intensely polarising. People either love your government and love Jacinda Ardern, or they still feel really, really, really angry. Why do you think that is?
Again, that's really for those people. I'd challenge whether it's a massive division in society. You know, I think
it's not necessarily 50-50,
no,
right? But there is.
But there is a group of people, absolutely,
yeah,
who are still very upset, very charged up about COVID and about vaccines. And for those people, that's obviously something they very deeply feel. I'm not saying that's not their legitimate feeling. I guess what I would say is we feel we were doing what was right. There's a lot of evidence to back that what we did was right. I don't like it for any politician to be the subject of the kind of abuse that I see hurled at Jacinda or other politicians. And I think it is time to kind of call that out and say, yep, you can feel that strongly about something, but the threats and the abuse just aren't right.
See, on that point, do you think if she wanted to, that Jacinda Ardern could come back and live a peaceful, undisturbed life in New Zealand right now?
Well, I'm not sure there's any Prime Minister who could do that.
I think John Key's pretty comfortable.
Well, yeah, I don't know. But
Bill
look,
English is fine. No, see, I mean, like it's interesting because this hasn't really, it sort of feels like it's a kind of an elephant in the room. Like we're years from the response, and there are still clearly, even if it's a small portion of society, there are still some New Zealanders who feel incredibly upset about elements of the response and about Jacinda Ardern in particular. And I just wonder if, I mean, you are close with her. Do you think if she were to live in New Zealand today, she could have the kind of undisturbed, peaceful life that you think she deserves as a Prime Minister?
Look, I'm not the person who can make that judgment. I know that Jacinda very much loves New Zealand. This is her home, and I'm sure we'll see her living here.
This relates to the COVID inquiry, because by my reckoning there are kind of three big occasions in which the people who now feel angriest about the COVID response and about Jacinda Ardern might feel that they have been denied a means of catharsis, right? So you had the protest, and we all saw the behaviour at the protest, but you chose not to meet the protesters. You're not fronting the COVID inquiry, and obviously Jacinda Ardern stood down, which I can imagine some of her opponents felt denied them an opportunity to see her voted out on their terms.
Well, I'm not going to indulge in that part of the argument.
Well, no, I just wonder though. No, I mean, I just wonder if you have considered like that denying those people an opportunity to feel like their anger has been heard. Has ultimately led to this anger enduring in a way that it might not have otherwise.
I think it's a pretty bizarre thing to say that someone should have to run an election and lose to satisfy people. I don't think that's a reasonable argument. On your second point, we have participated in the Royal Commission extensively, hours and hours of interviews and the invitation to ask more questions. So I don't accept that. On your broader point, that anger and that emotion that goes with that will be worked through by people in their own ways. I don't think going out onto the lawn of Parliament when there were nooses hanging in the trees, when people were making direct death threats against us, is a reasonable response.
No, I don't think anyone thinks.
So you've given three things there, Jack, and I don't think any of them are reasonable.
No. The point is whether or not different decisions about those 3 points might have given those people an outlet, like a release valve, right?
Look, and the Royal Commission has given a range of people the opportunity to have their say. Good stuff. We've been part of that.
In the book, you talk really frankly and openly about your sexuality. And in particular, you said, quote, "The cloud of your sexuality loomed large over the Labour leadership contest with David Cunliffe." Do you believe today, reflecting on that time, that your caucus colleagues weaponised your sexuality in that contest?
Well, I won the caucus vote, so no, really.
Well, the point was that some of your caucus colleagues and their supporters within different Labour branches around the country said things like, New Zealand will never elect a gay Prime Minister.
Look, it was definitely a big issue in that particular leadership election. It was a big issue in terms of the media's commentary and for some people in the party as well. And I tell the story in the book of a gay couple that came up to me in Christchurch after the Labour Party selection meeting there and said, "Oh, I think, Grant, you did so well. We're not going to vote for you though, because we don't think New Zealand's ready for a gay Prime Minister." And so it was a strange time, but we're not talking that long ago in New Zealand here. I'd love to think we're past that now, but it certainly was a factor at the time.
Do you think New Zealand would elect a gay Prime Minister today?
I'd like to hope so, yeah.
You'd like to hope so? You think they would?
I don't know. Who's out there?
You were widely regarded as a champion of women's sport, and you write a lot about what a sense of satisfaction it gave you being involved with the women's code across a range of sports. You also write about a robust encounter with the New Zealand Rugby CEO over the organisation's support or perceived support of the women's game at the time. Why didn't New Zealand Rugby see the same value in women's rugby that you saw?
Yeah, I want to preface my answer by saying I actually like Mark Robertson a lot and get on with him really well. In that moment, I was concerned that the emphasis that was being put on the women's team, the Black Ferns, just wasn't commensurate. I think that's grown over time, and I think the win in the World Cup's really helped with that. I think historically, commercially, men's rugby has outsold women's rugby, and I think that's a big driver. People like Mark and their jobs have to make the books balance, but I also think there's as well as being a great game to watch, there's an amazing product in women's rugby that isn't being fully exploited even today. So a lot of it's history, a lot of it's preconceived ideas about what might be popular or what someone might like, and I just think we've got to stick with it. There are generations of women who've worked so hard to get not just rugby but other sports to a place where it's professional or semi-professional. There's just even more room to grow there.
Do you think, given the proliferation of alternate leagues in different sports around the world at the moment, and some of the fiscal pressures on New Zealand's most popular sports, be it cricket, rugby, netball, etc., do you think it's realistic that any time soon our top women sports people in those sports, netball being an exception here, would be paid the same as men?
Well, in football, they've largely got there. In rugby, for the sevens, they've got there, but not for the 15s.
And there's still some way off.
And
there's certainly been improvement.
Yeah,
there's some way.
Yes, I do. I do think that can happen, and I do think it's about just good, courageous choices and backing people. You know, I look at a team like the Black Ferns, who are an amazing group of athletes, and going into this year's World Cup, they've had 4 or 5 test matches. You know, give them the full support, give them a full program, and you'll see an even higher level of performance.
You're obviously engaging a lot now with tertiary education, but in your current role, are you supportive of the government's education reforms in the secondary space?
I think broadly speaking, everybody agrees that NCEA needs some work, and certainly from a university perspective, that's a view that is shared. I just hope the government will take the appropriate amount of time to listen to the community, make sure we retain what's good about the system, but make the changes that we need.
Finally, you detailed a couple of really terrifying health episodes during your time in government. You suffered from acute stress, you had back problems, you were briefly paralysed after a procedure went wrong, which must have
it wasn't great.
Been terrible. Well, I mean, I know that you see the role of politics as benefiting the greater good, but I wonder about you at an individual level. Do you think a lot about how your time in government impacted you personally, and have you noticed what a difference it makes being on the outside?
Yeah, I'm still grateful for the opportunity that I had. I mean, it's such a privilege to play the kind of role that I got to play. And yeah, I wasn't well in parts of it, and my back's still not brilliant. But taking away some of the stress of politics has definitely helped my physical and mental health.